The smell of fried onions still clung to the curtains when Emily Donovan vanished. On the night of March 3, 1992, winter refused to surrender to spring in Cambria County, Pennsylvania. A late squall blew across the Allegheny Plateau, icing the shoulders of Route 56 and driving most travelers off the road by dusk. Inside Donovan's Diner, a narrow chrome building 3 miles east of Johnstown, the coffee pots hissed, the jukebox flickered through its last song, and a red neon open sign buzzed against the glass, casting a heartbeat glow over the empty parking lot. At 10:47 p.m., Emily wiped the counter, flipped the stools upside down, and told her coworker, Jerry Foster, she'd finish closing alone. Jerry had a new baby at home, and Emily, always the caretaker, insisted he leave early. "Go on," she'd said, tightening the laces on her black non-slip shoes. "I'll lock up, same as always." She'd been working the night shift since high school graduation. 5 years of pies. Before we continue this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light, and the algorithm gods will make sure you don't miss any future uploads. Truckers and overnight shifts that paid for community college classes she never had time to finish. Her father, Frank Donovan, a retired steelworker from the Bethlehem plant that had gone silent 6 years earlier, still stopped by every night at 10 sharp for decaf and conversation. That night the storm had kept him home. He'd promised to swing by in the morning to fix a flickering kitchen light. By dawn, he'd be standing in that same kitchen staring at his daughter's untouched uniform and wondering how anyone could vanish from a locked diner beneath a sign that never went dark. At 7:05 a.m., the first regular customer, Edna Hobbs, pulled into the lot, expecting to see Emily sweeping the entryway. Instead, the neon sign still burned red, the front door was locked from inside, and a thin trail of condensation fogged the glass above the latch. Edna knocked, then cupped her hands to peer inside. The coffee urns were cold, the chairs still upside down, the cash register closed. A single mug sat by the pie case, half full of coffee gone the color of rust. She tried the side door, locked. She walked around back, calling Emily's name, her voice carrying over the hiss of traffic from the highway. That was when she saw the light. The fluorescent tube above the rear entrance flickered erratically, revealing a scattering of footprints pressed into the thin crust of snow, leading away from the door toward the dumpster enclosure. The prints ended at the corner of the grease trap pit, a concrete square covered by a hinged metal grate. Edna would later tell police that something about that open grate, its hinge rusted, its lid slightly ajar, made her stomach drop. She didn't lift it. She went straight to the payphone inside the gas station across the road and dialed 911. Deputy Mark Riley of the Cambria County Sheriff's Department was first on scene at 7:26 a.m. He'd handled break-ins, bar fights, domestic calls, but missing person reports were rare in a town that measured its news by steel mill layoffs and high school football scores. Riley jimmied the diner's front door, using a spare key kept in a magnet box beneath the awning, Emily's habit for deliveries. The bell over the door chimed, absurdly cheerful as he entered the silent building. The air smelled faintly of fryer oil and lemon cleaner. Nothing appeared disturbed. Stools aligned, register balanced, lights off except the buzzing neon sign. The wall clock read 10:59 p.m., stopped, battery dead. Riley's flashlight beam caught a smear of something dark near the service door handle, small enough to be grease, but darker, tackier. He radioed for backup and preservation of scene. Within an hour, the parking lot was cordoned with yellow tape flapping in the wind. The neon finally unplugged, and the entire county awake to the realization that Frank Donovan's daughter hadn't made it home. Detective Elaine Hollis arrived just after 9 a.m., her sedan fishtailing on black ice as she turned into the lot. Hollis had transferred from Pittsburgh PD 2 years earlier after burnout from narcotics work. She wore her exhaustion like a second badge, coffee thermos permanently in hand. She walked the perimeter, noting the footprints Edna had described. They were shallow, half filled with sleet, size small. Women's, likely Emily's, leading out, not in. Another set overlapped them, deeper, larger, pointed toward the alley that led behind the diner to the drainage ditch running parallel to the old rail spur. Those prints faded after 20 feet, swallowed by the snow and tire ruts. No signs of forced entry at either door. Inside, Hollis photographed everything before CSU arrived. The register contained $182 in singles and fives, untouched. Emily's purse hung on the coat hook beside the employee bathroom. Her car keys dangled from the ignition of her rust-colored '87 Cavalier parked behind the building. Engine cold, driver door locked. Her wallet and ID were on the passenger seat. Every sign pointed to a woman who'd intended to close up and drive home minutes later. Frank Donovan reached the diner around 10:15, escorted past the tape by a deputy who'd known him since Little League coaching days. He stared through the doorway at the silent counter, his calloused hands twitching as if reaching for a wrench that wasn't there. "She wouldn't leave it like that," he said quietly. "She never left a mess." Hollis listened, noting tone, composure, factual recall, the subtle measurements of trauma she'd learned to read. Frank described their nightly routine, her closing checklist, the stubborn latch on the back door she always double-checked. When Hollis asked if Emily had mentioned plans, boyfriends, anyone new at work, he shook his head. She worked, came home, slept, did it again. Said she was saving for nursing school. That was her whole life. The detective scribbled in her notebook, already cataloging variables: isolated location, cash business, closing shift, single young female, no sign of robbery or struggle. It fit the pattern she hated most. The predator who learned a routine and waited. By noon, forensic techs had swabbed every surface. The smear near the rear door proved to be mixed residue of animal fat and industrial solvent, common in grease traps. But a separate sample from the floor near the prep sink tested positive for trace hemoglobin. Small quantity, possibly from a cut hand, but enough to warrant full DNA analysis. In 1992, that meant weeks of waiting. Hollis ordered the grease pit drained. The vacuum pump operators worked under a tarp while sleet pelted the metal roof. Nothing but gray sludge, fryer remnants, and paper debris surfaced. No human remains. Still, the pit's lid bore a partial handprint impressed in oil, too smudged for immediate identification. Hollis had it photographed and cast. The evening news aired live from the parking lot before the diner sign had even cooled, broadcasting the first images of Frank Donovan's haunted stare to every home in Cambria County. For weeks afterward, locals would replay that footage whenever they mentioned the case. The look of a man who'd survived the death of industry, only to face the disappearance of his daughter. The search expanded along the Conemaugh River floodplain, volunteers wading through waist-high slush with sticks and flashlights, calling her name into the wind. They found nothing. Helicopters from the state police scanned heat signatures. Dogs lost scent near the drainage ditch where the footprints ended. The investigation's first 48 hours produced more rumors than evidence. Truckers reported a dark van idling by the highway turnout around 11 p.m. A paperboy claimed he saw headlights leaving the diner's lot just before midnight. A waitress from the night shift across town insisted Emily had been receiving strange phone calls at work. A man asking for her by first name, hanging up when others answered. Hollis chased every lead. Each dissolved into coincidence or misidentification. By the end of March, the diner reopened under a new manager, and the red neon open sign flickered back to life, a hollow gesture toward normalcy. Frank refused to set foot inside. He set up a corkboard in his garage instead, tacking maps, timelines, and newspaper clippings beside his old welding tools. He marked sightings on a county map with color-coded pins. At night, the garage lights burned long after midnight, visible from the street, a beacon for neighbors who didn't know what to say. Hollis visited weekly, sometimes bringing new flyers, sometimes only to reassure him that the case hadn't gone cold. But internally, the department was already stretched thin. Budget cuts, layoffs, overlapping jurisdictions. The lab backlog for DNA analysis stretched past 90 days. By summer, the sample from the diner floor came back. Female, matching Emily's toothbrush reference sample, confirming the blood was hers. Cause or context remained unknown. With no suspect, no witness, and no body, the case joined a growing shelf labeled pending. Hollis never stopped reviewing it. Each anniversary, she drove the stretch of Route 56, headlights sweeping the rusted guardrails, searching for what she'd missed. When state funding for cold case review units arrived in 2015, Emily Donovan's file was among the first reopened. Hollis, now retired but consulting part-time, sat beside younger detectives explaining how evidence once dismissed as environmental contamination might hold microscopic clues. Technology had changed. Industrial degreaser samples preserved in glass vials since '92 could now reveal molecular signatures unique to specific manufacturers. One compound in the diner samples, a fluorinated solvent banned in '95, was traced to a single steel mill maintenance supplier still operating under a new name. Records showed limited distribution to a union local in Johnstown and a nearby machine shop where Frank's old co-workers still gathered. Among those members was Harold Hal Bennett, former union steward, maintenance foreman and lifelong friend of the Donovan family. That name would surface again years later, when a warehouse cleanup uncovered sealed drums of the same solvent, and a DNA swab from one rusted lid matched a partial profile preserved from the diner's rear door handprint. But on that cold March morning in 1992, none of that existed. There was only the silence of a locked diner, a father staring through glass, and a detective who couldn't yet see the threads connecting industrial residue, labor loyalty, and a trusted man who'd helped everyone but left one young woman behind. The winter after Emily Donovan vanished seemed to last longer than any in memory, not because of temperature or snowfall, but because time itself refused to move forward in Johnstown. The diner's neon glow returned, but its hum carried a faint note of guilt, the sound of a community trying to ignore what it couldn't explain. Frank Donovan quit attending his union breakfasts, stopped showing up at St. Bridget's on Sundays, and avoided the VFW where he'd once spent evenings arguing about the Steelers and mill politics. Every conversation turned eventually toward Emily, and every condolence felt like a reminder that no one knew anything. Detective Elaine Hollis worked the case until the department quietly reclassified it as inactive that summer. She told Frank it was procedure, not surrender, but both of them recognized the euphemism. Without new evidence, a missing person investigation in Cambria County faded into rumor like smoke from the mill stacks that no longer burned. Hollis kept the file on her desk anyway. Some nights she'd stay after hours, spreading photos across the worn blotter under flickering fluorescent light, trying to spot the detail that would break the pattern. She couldn't let go of the grease trap residue, the mixture of animal fat and industrial solvent too strong for a diner kitchen. She'd taken samples home in sealed vials against regulation, storing them in her freezer between bags of ice. "Evidence that smells like a lie," she wrote in her notebook. No one else cared. The DA's office had moved on. In 1993, a body surfaced 30 miles west, in a strip mine pit near Seward. Media rushed to speculate. It was young, female, decomposed beyond easy identification. Frank drove there himself before Hollis could stop him, only to watch the coroner zip a stranger into a black bag. He didn't speak for days after. When DNA finally ruled the body out, public interest evaporated. Frank returned to his garage map, adding new pins for every false lead, every rumor of a drifter or hitchhiker sighting. The pins formed constellations no one could interpret, a geography of grief that covered 3 counties. By 1996, the Donovan case was folklore. Teenagers dared each other to park behind the diner after closing, shining flashlights toward the grease pit as if Emily's ghost would appear. Truckers swapped versions of the story at rest stops. Some said she'd run off to Florida, others claimed the union hid something. The phrase grease trap girl entered local slang, a cruel shorthand for unresolved loss. Hollis hated the nickname. Each time she heard it at a bar or grocery line, she'd turn and correct whoever spoke it. Her tone flat and final. Her name was Emily. The next official review came in 2001 when Cambria County formed a joint task force with the state police to clear old case backlogs. Hollis, then 54, was months from retirement. Her request to reopen the Donovan file met polite indifference, until a rookie technician stumbled across an evidence box mislabeled environmental samples, don't test. Inside were the vials she'd ordered sealed in '92, still intact, the labels fading but legible. The tech logged them into the new database. Hollis felt a pulse of something like hope, though she tried not to show it. She authorized retesting under newer spectrographic methods, focusing on the solvent mixture that had confused labs before. 2 months later, the report arrived. The solvent contained trace compounds found only in a brand called Clearsol 42. Discontinued after an EPA recall in 1995 and primarily distributed to industrial maintenance departments, particularly those servicing steel and manufacturing plants. The connection jolted Hollis. Only a handful of organizations in Cambria County had used Clearsol 42, Bethlehem Steel, the Municipal Works Department, and the Machinists' Union Hall that maintained shared tools and cleaning supplies for its members. The hall was still open then, a sagging brick building near the Conemaugh River with a faded sign reading, "Sure you're subscribed to stay updated on more cases like this. These families deserve to have their stories told, and your support helps ensure these victims are never forgotten." Local 314 Brotherhood of Steelworkers. Hollis visited under pretext of a safety audit. Inside, she found rows of lockers labeled with names she recognized from Frank's stories: Bennett, Russo, Carver, and others who'd worked the mills before the shutdown. Hal Bennett, union steward, greeted her with the steady confidence of a man accustomed to authority even in decline. He was in his late 40s, thick-necked, neatly shaven, wearing a flannel shirt that smelled faintly of solvent and machine oil. "You still chasing that diner thing?" he asked when she mentioned the test results. Hollis studied his face for reaction and caught only mild amusement. "Thought they closed that case years ago," he said. "Poor Frank. Never did get peace." She noticed his hands, broad, scarred, nails permanently dark from years of grease, and the faint tremor when he picked up his coffee. "We used that cleaner for everything back then," he continued. "Kept the pipes from gumming up. Damn near stripped paint off walls, though. Surprised anyone still had a sample." She thanked him for his time and left, telling herself suspicion wasn't evidence. Still, when she reached her car, she wrote his name in the margin of her notebook and underlined it twice. Hollis retired that winter, boxes of files following her home like ghosts. She promised Frank she'd keep looking in her own way. He nodded but didn't seem to hear. The garage corkboard had grown into an entire wall by then, every inch covered in maps and photocopies. The steelworker's patience had hardened into obsession. He'd started writing letters to journalists, state senators, the FBI. Most went unanswered. When his health began failing in the early 2000s, congestive heart disease from years of mill dust and cigarettes, he told neighbors he just wanted to know before he died whether his daughter had suffered. In 2015, long after Hollis had given up expecting closure, the Pennsylvania Bureau of Criminal Investigation launched a statewide DNA backlog initiative. Old evidence was digitized and retested with advanced polymerase chain techniques that could recover genetic material invisible to earlier technology. One of those evidence kits bore the label Cambria Donovan Diner. Inside, the smudged handprint cast from the grease pit lid and a cotton swab sealed since March 1992. The partial print contained trace biological residue, sweat, epithelial cells, enough to extract a low-yield male DNA profile. The system flagged a partial match to a new entry submitted from a routine employment screening at Cambria County Works Department. The name attached, Harold Hal Bennett. The result wasn't enough for an arrest, but it reignited the case. Detective Luis Ortega, then 34, inherited the Donovan file. He reached out to Hollis for consultation. When she saw Bennett's name, she felt the air leave her lungs. Ortega began quiet background work: employment history, criminal record, financial stress. Bennett had retired in 2010 with a modest pension, twice divorced, no children, still living in the same brick bungalow near the river. His neighbors described him as helpful, the kind who shoveled sidewalks and fixed leaky gutters for free. He volunteered at the food bank. No one could imagine him involved in anything darker than a bar argument. But Ortega noticed inconsistencies. Bennett had claimed in a 1992 interview that he was working an overnight maintenance call at the municipal garage on March 3rd. Timesheets confirmed his punch-in at 6 p.m., but no punch-out. The supervisor then was his cousin, who'd signed the sheet manually. The garage log showed no work order that night. When Ortega re-interviewed the cousin, now retired in Florida, the man hesitated before admitting he'd filled the paperwork as a favor. Hal said he was checking a leak, he recalled. Didn't think twice. We all helped each other back then. The leak had been real, but in a different facility, 1 mile away. The alibi crumbled quietly. Bennett, confronted with the discrepancy, shrugged. 30 years ago, Detective. Memory's a tricky thing. His calm unnerved Ortega. The detective sent for another round of DNA testing using new YSTR analysis to confirm the partial match. While waiting, he revisited evidence storage. Among Emily Donovan's personal effects was a red bandana found in her car's glove box, tagged miscellaneous cloth. No analysis had ever been done. When Ortega submitted it, the lab recovered both female and male DNA. The male profile matched the grease pit sample precisely. The connection was undeniable. News of renewed testing leaked to the local press before charges were filed. By the summer of 2018, whispers filled every diner and bar along Route 56. The Union Man might have done it. Frank Donovan didn't live to hear it. He died 2 years earlier, heart finally failing after decades of waiting. Hollis attended the funeral, standing in the back pew beside Ortega. She told him softly, "He'd want you to finish it right." When the full DNA report arrived that December, it eliminated doubt. Statistical certainty exceeded 1 in 1 trillion. The sample from the grease pit handprint, the solvent residue, and the bandana all belonged to Harold Bennett. The DA authorized a sealed indictment while surveillance teams documented his routine. Bennett's life looked unchanged. Coffee at sunrise, crossword on the porch, volunteering on Wednesdays. But detectives noticed a ritual. Every Friday evening he drove out to the old Bethlehem Steel grounds, now an overgrown industrial park. He'd park near the river overlook and sit for hours, staring at the water. Ortega believed the location mattered. Historical aerial maps showed that in 1992, before redevelopment, that section of the riverbank held a waste discharge channel lined with drums of degreaser, Clearsol 42 among them. The same chemical that stained Emily's uniform samples. On January 7, 2019, officers moved in. They found Bennett at the overlook, thermos beside him, watching the frozen river. When Ortega approached, badge visible, Bennett sighed as if expecting him. "You finally found what was left," he said. "Took you long enough." He didn't resist arrest. At booking, he declined a lawyer and asked only one question. Did Frank know before he died? Inside interrogation room 2, under humming fluorescents not unlike those in the diner 30 years earlier, Bennett began to talk. Hal Bennett's first confession came in fragments, pieces of a story eroded by decades of denial and drink. In the sterile glow of the interview room, his words spilled slow, hesitant, like someone relearning speech after too long in silence. Detective Luis Ortega kept the tape rolling, saying little, letting the pauses drag until Bennett filled them. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. Bennett began, staring at his hands cuffed on the table. "I was just supposed to talk to her." Ortega waited. The older man's shoulders hunched, breath shallow, a mechanic who'd spent half his life breathing solvent fumes and steel dust. "I knew Emily," he said finally. "Everyone did. Her dad was one of us. When the mill shut down, Frank was on my crew. He took it hard. Emily used to bring sandwiches during strikes. She was a kid then. Good kid." He looked up briefly, eyes red-rimmed. "When you spend your life fixing broken things, you think you can fix people too. But some things—" He trailed off. Ortega prompted softly, "Tell me about that night." Bennett rubbed his wrists against the cuffs. "She called the hall that afternoon," he said. "Asked about some paperwork for her dad's pension. Said the checks weren't coming right. I told her I'd stop by the diner after my shift, thought it'd be quick." The time cards, Ortega noted silently, had no record of such a call. "I went over around 10, maybe quarter after," Bennett continued. "Snow coming down hard. Diner lights still on. She was mopping. I told her about the pension forms, said I could look into it. She thanked me, made coffee. We talked about her taking nursing classes. She said she wanted to get out of Johnstown. I told her folks like us don't get out. We hold the walls up while the rest leave." His mouth tightened. She laughed, not mean, just young. I got angry. Stupid pride. I told her she didn't know what it was like watching everything you built rot. She said, "Maybe it's not my job to fix it." Then she turned to lock up. Bennett's voice dropped to a rasp. I grabbed her arm. Just reflex. She pulled back, slipped on the wet floor, hit her head on the counter edge. Went down fast, real fast. Silence filled the room, punctuated by the hum of the ventilation fan. Ortega watched, measuring the tremor in Bennett's hands. "You tried to help her?" Bennett nodded weakly. Checked her pulse. Nothing. Blood coming from the back of her head. I panicked. I'd had a few drinks after work. Didn't want it to look bad. Thought they'd think I was some creep. So I cleaned up. Used the degreaser from the truck. It cuts anything. Blood, grease, doesn't matter. Wiped the counter, the floor. Didn't realize the smell would stick. I just wanted it gone. Ortega asked where he took the body. Bennett's eyes drifted toward the observation mirror. Out back, he said. It was still snowing. I carried her. She was light. Put her in the truck bed under the tarp. I drove to the plant. Knew the gate guard. He never checked. Drove to the old coolant channel by the river. There was a drum half full of solvent. I thought... His voice cracked. I thought it'd hide her. Steel dissolves everything eventually. I didn't think anyone would ever look there. Ortega pressed for details. The location, the angle of the road, landmarks. Bennett described it precisely. The second service lane past the maintenance shed, a rusted crane still standing by the embankment, a single oak tree leaning over the water. He stopped, breathing hard. I left her there, he said. Sat in the truck until the sign lights back at the diner went out. That's what I remember. The red light fading through the snow. For hours, Ortega let him talk, circling back, testing for inconsistencies. None appeared. Bennett's recollection had the dull clarity of long obsession, a man who'd replayed a single night until it hardened into permanent truth. When the transcript reached the district attorney, it read less like a confession of murder and more like a chronicle of cowardice. A man so afraid of accountability that he chose erasure over decency. But it was enough. Search warrants were signed by morning. The next day, under freezing rain, a convoy of police vehicles rolled through the gates of the abandoned Bethlehem steel site. The property had become a wilderness of concrete, rust, and stubborn weeds. Ortega led a joint team from state forensics and environmental recovery. The coordinates Bennett provided matched a fenced section of the riverbank, half collapsed into the water. Excavators cleared decades of sediment and industrial debris, while technicians donned hazmat suits. By afternoon, they'd uncovered the corroded remains of a 55-gallon drum, its lid sealed with lead solder. The faded stencil read, Clear Sol 42, for industrial use only. When they pried it open, the chemical stench forced everyone back. Inside lay the degraded remnants of human bone, fragments of fabric consistent with diner uniforms, and a tarnished necklace bearing the initial E. The coroner would later confirm the remains through mitochondrial DNA from a lock of hair Linda Donovan had saved in a jewelry box for 27 years. News spread through Johnstown before the official press conference. By evening, the diner's parking lot was crowded again. Reporters, onlookers, and old union men standing in clusters, faces pale in the flashing lights. Some cursed Bennett's name. Others shook their heads, refusing to believe. Hal wouldn't hurt nobody, one man said on camera, eyes watering. He fixed my furnace last winter. Inside the sheriff's department, Ortega watched the broadcast without sound, feeling neither triumph nor relief. Closure was too clean a word for what had unfolded. Bennett's formal statement ran 36 pages. Beyond the initial account, he added details that complicated any notion of accident. He admitted knowing the diner's layout intimately. He'd repaired its grease trap months earlier, explaining the solvent traces. He confessed to locking the front door from inside before leaving through the rear, mimicking Emily's routine to create the illusion she'd vanished from a sealed building. He even described scraping his boot prints to confuse investigators, remembering how the snow had crusted into a shell that shattered under weight. I wanted it to look impossible, he said. If it looked impossible, they'd stop looking. For prosecutors, intent became the central question. The autopsy, limited by decomposition, couldn't determine whether Emily's skull fracture came from a fall or blunt force. But Bennett's deliberate concealment, the chemical destruction, and the staging of the scene satisfied the legal threshold for second-degree murder. The district attorney announced charges on January 9, 2019. Murder, abuse of a corpse, obstruction of justice. Hollis, now 72, attended the press conference, sitting quietly in the back. When reporters asked how she felt after all those years, she answered simply, "I wish Frank were here to see that we never stopped." As the trial preparations began, the story consumed regional media. Old headlines were reprinted, grainy photos of Emily smiling beside her father at a Labor Day picnic juxtaposed against mugshots of the man who'd once been their neighbor. The narrative struck a chord. Blue-collar trust betrayed, an accident turned secret, Justice delayed but not denied. Talk radio hosts debated whether it was murder or panic. Former co-workers described Bennett as disciplined, proud, sometimes controlling. One remembered him berating younger members for forgetting what the union stands for. Another recalled, "A night in '93 when Bennett got drunk and muttered, 'Hit the like button if you believe cold cases deserve more attention. The river keeps its own.'" During pre-trial discovery, Ortega unearthed documents that deepened the moral rot beneath the case. Internal memos from 1992 showed that union officials had quietly investigated a missing barrel of Clearsol from their shared inventory, but never reported it, fearing OSHA violations. Bennett, as steward, had signed the reconciliation report declaring all chemicals accounted for. The falsified paperwork preserved in the hall's archives connected him to the very solvent that erased Emily's body. It also revealed a broader culture of silence, men protecting one of their own to avoid scandal at a time when the union itself teetered on collapse. None of them had known what he'd done, but their fear of exposure had ensured no one looked too closely. The community's loyalty had become complicity. In March 2019, investigators drained a secondary section of the river channel searching for remaining evidence. Divers recovered pieces of the drum's base and a bent key ring matching the spare key Frank Donovan had given Emily 2 weeks before she disappeared. Hollis held it in her palm when Ortega showed her, the metal warped from years underwater. "She never even locked him out," she murmured. Bennett's defense argued diminished capacity, claiming the incident was an alcohol-fueled accident compounded by decades of guilt. He pleaded guilty to third-degree murder to avoid trial. The judge, citing extraordinary premeditation in the cover-up, sentenced him to 25 to 50 years. At sentencing, Bennett spoke only once. "If I could trade places with her, I would." But the river already took what it wanted. Linda Donovan attended every hearing. She'd aged into a quiet figure in a gray coat, her expression unreadable. When asked by reporters whether she forgave him, she said, "Forgiveness is for people who still have something left to give. I just want the truth to stay written down somewhere it can't be buried again." After sentencing, Ortega drove alone to the diner. It had closed months earlier, unable to survive the resurgence of notoriety. Dust coated the counter where Emily once poured coffee. The neon sign still hung in the window, unplugged, half of its letters dark. He stood there in silence, imagining that night. The hiss of the fryer, the scrape of a stool, the sudden thud of a head hitting chrome. Outside, the sky turned the same dull steel color as the river. Justice had come, but it felt hollow. A ledger balanced without profit. Back at the station, Ortega filed the final report. Under case outcome, he typed a single line. "Resolved. Truth recovered. Innocence lost." He closed the folder and placed it beside a stack of cold cases, still waiting for their own impossible answers. In the margin of his notes, he wrote the phrase Hollis had repeated over the years. "Some walls you hold up by remembering what fell." The story should have ended with the sentencing, but Johnstown didn't know how to let go. Closure in small towns was an illusion. People kept living in the same houses, driving the same roads, seeing ghosts in the faces of their neighbors. After Bennett's conviction, the county courthouse lawn became an informal memorial. Someone taped Emily's photo to a lamppost beside a plastic bouquet. Every few weeks, fresh flowers appeared, even in winter, the stems freezing into the ground. Local news stations ran anniversary segments, replaying the same archive footage of the diner and the rusting mill, while commentators asked why it had taken 27 years for justice. Hollis hated those pieces. They made it sound like time had solved the case on its own, as if the truth had floated conveniently to the surface instead of being dragged out by obsession and chance. She stayed away from cameras, declining interviews, but she watched every broadcast, listening for what they got wrong. They always got something wrong. Bennett went to State Correctional Institution, Somerset, 30 miles away. Prison suited him poorly. Within weeks, he suffered a stroke that left his right side partially paralyzed. When Ortega learned of it, he drove to Somerset Hospital to witness the deposition in case the old man died before appeal. Bennett lay in a hospital bed, eyes dull but aware. The district attorney's assistant read his rights, then began the formal questioning. Ortega sat quietly in the corner until Bennett turned his head slightly and said, "You still don't have it all." The assistant paused. "What do you mean?" Bennett coughed, voice rough. "I wasn't the only one there that night. For a moment, the room froze. The recorder kept spinning, capturing the rasp of machines and the distant hospital intercom. "Who else was there, Hal?" Ortega asked. Bennett blinked slowly. "You think I got that drum into the truck alone? You think I locked that diner without a second key? Someone helped me." But when pressed for a name, he only muttered, "Check the logs," and drifted back into silence. It might have been delirium, but Ortega couldn't ignore it. The case file said Bennett acted alone, but the physical logistics had always bothered him. Emily's body, the 50-gallon drum, the transportation, all doable, yet unlikely for a single man of his size during a blizzard. He revisited the evidence storage, combing through decades-old logs and call sheets. One entry stood out. At 10:38 p.m. on March 3, 1992, a service call was logged by the municipal garage dispatcher for plumbing overflow, Donovan's Diner. The notation was crossed out later, marked duplicate entry, no technician name attached. The handwriting was round, old-fashioned, nothing like Bennett's. The signature at the bottom belonged to a supervisor named Thomas "Tommy" Keene. Keene had been Bennett's second-in-command at the Union Hall, known for his easy charm and perpetual cigarette dangling from his mouth. He'd moved to North Carolina in the late 1990s, bought a boat, and lived quietly on a veteran's pension. Ortega tracked him down through property records. When he called, Keene answered on the second ring, voice thin with age but cautious. Ortega identified himself, mentioned Bennett's statement. There was a pause, then a slow exhale. "That old fool should have kept his mouth shut," Keene said. "I already told everything I know 30 years ago." Ortega replied, "Your name's on a service log that night." Another pause. "Then maybe you should come ask me in person," Keene said, and hung up. 2 days later, Ortega flew to Wilmington. Keene lived in a sun-bleached house overlooking a marina, wind chimes clattering in the coastal air. He looked frail, oxygen tube clipped to his nose, but his eyes were clear. "Hal always liked to talk," he said, before Ortega could speak. "Talked himself into trouble, talked the rest of us into covering for him." Ortega asked if he'd been at the diner. Keene stared at the horizon. "He called me from the hall that night. Said there was an accident, needed a hand. I thought maybe one of the fryers caught fire. When I got there, she was already gone. I told him we had to call the cops. He said nobody would believe it was an accident, not after he'd been drinking. He begged, said Frank had enough grief. I panicked. I helped him move her. That's all." He rubbed his temples, trembling. "I told myself I was saving 2 lives instead of losing 3. But every night I heard that sign buzzing in my head." Ortega recorded the statement, though Keene refused to sign it. "What's the point now?" he asked. "He's locked up. She's dead, and I'm half in the grave." 2 months later, Keene suffered a fatal heart attack, leaving only a brief handwritten note found in his desk drawer. "I was there. I was weak. I'm sorry, Frank." The coroner mailed the note to the district attorney, who added it to the file as supplemental evidence, too late for additional prosecution. For the first time in years, Ortega felt the peculiar ache of justice half done. The revelation fractured what remained of the town's faith. For decades, the Union had been both shield and identity. Discovering that 2 of its own had been part of Emily's disappearance felt like betrayal twice over. Old-timers stopped wearing their local 314 jackets. The hall, already barely active, closed within a year, its tools auctioned off, the sign taken down. At the sale, Hollis stood among the buyers, watching strangers bid on the remnants of history. One item caught her eye, a brass wall plaque listing members lost in service to the Brotherhood. Frank Donovan's name was there, chiseled in pride. Beneath it, someone had scratched the initials ED with a screwdriver. Hollis bought the plaque and later hung it in her home office. "She held the walls, too," she whispered. Meanwhile, the state's attorney general ordered an internal review of why the 1992 investigation had failed. Files revealed lost opportunities, the misfiled solvent samples, the untested bandana, the dismissed footprints. The report stopped short of blaming individuals, but its subtext was clear: small-town resource scarcity combined with institutional bias. In 1992, a young waitress's disappearance during a blizzard didn't command the same urgency as a high-profile case from the city. That quiet neglect had allowed a killer to age in peace. The findings spurred reforms: mandatory evidence retention audits, digital cataloging, state-funded DNA preservation. Emily Donovan's name became a case study in academy lectures across Pennsylvania. How persistence, not luck, solves cold cases. Linda Donovan withdrew from public life. The day Bennett died in prison in 2021, she didn't comment. When reporters called, she issued a single written statement. "My daughter's life was short." The investigation was long. Neither should have been. After that, she stopped answering calls. Neighbors said she spent her days tending to a small garden behind her apartment building, growing tomatoes like the ones Emily used to slice for diner sandwiches. She passed away quietly in 2023, her obituary running one column wide beneath an ad for auto repair. Hollis attended the funeral alone. Only a few townspeople came, mostly retirees who still remembered. After the service, she stood at the graveside, touching the stone that read simply, "Emily Donovan, 1967-1992, beloved daughter, never forgotten." Snow began to fall, soft as ash. For Ortega, the case lingered like a taste he couldn't wash away. He'd moved on to other assignments, cybercrime, financial fraud, but Emily's file stayed in the drawer behind his desk. Sometimes he opened it to remind himself what time and loyalty could destroy. One evening, months after Keene's confession, he received a package at the station with no return address. Inside was a faded photograph, the diner in 1990. The staff lined up smiling, including a younger Emily with her arm around a tall man in overalls, Bennett, and another man half-cropped by the frame whose face Ortega didn't recognize. On the back, someone had written, "He was there too." No signature. The mystery photo reopened old questions. Who had taken it and why send it now? The partial figure in the frame wore a maintenance badge, but the text was too blurred to read. Ortega sent the image to digital forensics for enhancement. When the results returned, the name tag appeared faintly, R. Kavanaugh. A search through union rosters showed one Robert Kavanaugh, a welder's apprentice in 1992, later fired for theft of materials. He'd disappeared from records in the late 90s. Ortega traced a trail of minor offenses, DUIs, assault, itinerant labor in West Virginia, and finally an address in a rehabilitation center outside Wheeling. Kavanaugh was 54, gaunt, eyes glassy from medication. When Ortega showed the photo, he nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's me. That was the old crew. Why?" Ortega explained the case, the confessions, the note. Kavanaugh frowned, rubbing his temple. "Hal and Tommy. Yeah, I remember the night the girl went missing. They were nervous next morning. Told me to shut up about the truck. Said it was hauling waste drums from the hall. I saw a tarp flapping in the bed, something under it. I didn't ask." He looked away. "They said the less I knew, the better. I figured it was stolen chemicals. Never thought." His voice trailed off. "I left town soon after. Couldn't stand it." He agreed to give a statement, adding one final detail. "There was someone else at the plant that night. I heard voices by the river, 2 men and a woman crying. Then a splash. I thought it was runoff. Maybe it wasn't." The timeline shifted again. If Kavanaugh's recollection was accurate, Emily might have still been alive when Bennett and Keene reached the river. The coroner's report could no longer prove otherwise, not after decades of chemical erosion, but the implication haunted Ortega. The idea that she'd woken up, injured, terrified, begging them to stop. The possibility twisted the narrative from accident to horror. He didn't tell Linda. She was already gone. He told no one except Hollis, who listened quietly, then said, "Some truths are too late to matter. But write it anyway." He did. In his final report addendum, Ortega included Kavanaugh's statement and the photo. The case officially closed again, but in the margins he added a personal note. Unresolved elements remain. Confirmed assistance by Keene, possible third-party witness at plant. Evidence inconclusive. It was as close to honesty as paperwork allowed. By the 31st anniversary in 2023, the diner had been demolished. A gas station stood in its place, its fluorescent lights humming over asphalt. Drivers filled their tanks unaware of what the ground beneath them held. Only a small brass marker near the curb, installed quietly by Hollis, bore the words, "In memory of Emily Donovan, whose story reminds us to keep asking." Most passers-by never noticed. But on some nights, when snow blew across Route 56 and the temperature dropped enough to crystallize the air, locals swore they could still see a faint red glow over the gas pumps, flickering like the old neon sign refusing to die. By the spring of 2024, the past was supposed to stay buried. The old Bethlehem steel property had been sold to a logistics company, and the site where the diner once stood was now a busy gas station with polished pumps and LED canopy lights, the kind that erase shadows. Most drivers didn't know or care about what had happened there 32 years earlier. But Detective Luis Ortega couldn't let go. He had transferred to a regional training division, teaching seminars on forensic persistence. Yet every time he lectured about the Donovan case, he felt a small wrongness at the edges, an unease he couldn't articulate. Kavanaugh's statement, the possibility that Emily had still been alive when the drum was sealed, had rewritten the story in his mind. It wasn't just a question of guilt anymore, but of mercy denied, and something in that still felt unfinished. He visited the site on a cold April morning, standing near Pump 4 while commuters filled their tanks. The air smelled of gasoline and wet asphalt, but beneath it he caught a faint chemical ghost, the memory of solvent and steel. The gas station manager, a young woman who hadn't been born in 1992, asked if he was with the utility crew. "Just checking old paperwork," he said, showing a badge that didn't explain much. He walked around back where the old foundation line still made a faint ridge in the soil. Construction crews had dug deep when replacing the underground tanks. But Ortega noticed an area near the drainage trench that sloped unnaturally, a shallow depression filled with gravel that hadn't settled evenly. Something about it bothered him, the pattern of erosion, the discoloration where runoff had carved a pale streak through darker soil. He photographed the spot, filed a note, and requested access to environmental inspection records. The company denied him, citing property rights, so he went through the state environmental agency instead. 2 weeks later, a compliance officer named Darlene Koenig called. "Funny you asked about that lot," she said. "We had minor contamination reports during excavation. Trace solvents, hydrocarbons, and something odd, fluorinated residues not typical of gasoline. We filed it as legacy industrial waste." Ortega's pulse quickened. Clearsol 42 contained fluorinated compounds. If runoff from the diner's original grease pit had migrated under the building, it could have preserved micro-evidence. Fibers, residues, shielded from weather for decades. Koenig agreed to meet on-site with a soil probe and spectrometer. When they dug half a meter down near the drainage slope, the probe tip came up slick with dark sludge that smelled faintly of metal and decay. Laboratory analysis confirmed degreaser remnants and, astonishingly, traces of human keratin, degraded hair protein, embedded in the soil matrix. It shouldn't have been possible after 30 years of exposure, yet there it was, molecular testimony that part of Emily's remains had been disposed closer than anyone knew. Ortega realized the implications. Bennett's confession about taking her entire body to the plant had been a lie. Some portion, perhaps hair, blood, tissue, had been cleaned and buried right there, under the diner itself, before he left with the drum. Whether out of panic or ritual, he had tried to erase her twice. The discovery reopened the case file administratively, though no prosecution remained. Hollis, now in assisted living, listened over speakerphone as Ortega described the findings. Her voice was faint but steady. "You found the last piece," she said. "He wanted to make her disappear completely. Now she's everywhere, in the dirt, in our memory, in the laws they changed because of her." Ortega visited her the next week, bringing photos of the soil cores. She smiled without looking at them. "Don't show me proof," she said. "Just tell me she can rest now." He wasn't sure she could. When environmental crews continued testing, they uncovered something stranger, a metallic object lodged in the soil, a bent bracelet clasp with an engraved date on the inside, 2/14/92, Valentine's Day. That date matched an earlier diary entry from Emily, recovered years ago, in which she wrote about a gift from someone unexpected who'd left it on the counter wrapped in a napkin. Investigators had assumed it came from a customer or family friend. Now the bracelet's discovery beneath the diner's footprint suggested premeditation, perhaps an unwanted advance. The initials scratched inside, barely legible under corrosion, read H.B. Hal Bennett. He had visited weeks before the disappearance, leaving a token he later used to justify seeing her again. It reframed everything, not a spontaneous accident, but a pattern of attention, a slow tightening of interest disguised as kindness. As Ortega documented the find, local media caught wind of renewed excavation. News vans returned, headlines screaming, "New evidence unearthed in Donovan case." The gas station owner protested the intrusion. Customers came to gawk at the fenced-off corner where technicians sifted through soil under portable lights. One evening, a teenage cashier asked Ortega why he cared so much. Because forgetting is how it happens again, he said. The girl frowned, not quite understanding, but she handed him a cup of coffee anyway. My grandma said she knew her, she murmured. Said she always gave extra pie to kids. It was the kind of small human detail that no report could capture. The new analysis produced one last revelation. Mixed into the solvent layer were microscopic flecks of synthetic fiber, polyester uniform threads, entangled with cellulose from paper. Under magnification, one fragment bore faint printed ink, part of a signature loop, blue ballpoint, consistent with carbon copy invoice paper used in maintenance logs. Ortega requested comparison with surviving Union Hall documents from 1992. One matched perfectly, the lower loop of the T in Thomas Keene. His discarded carbon sheets, likely torn up during the cover-up, had been swept out with the wash water and buried under the diner. It was the physical link proving Keene's presence at the scene, proof that he hadn't merely helped move the body, but had stood inside the diner while Bennett cleaned up. Ortega submitted a supplemental report to the district attorney's office, though it carried no legal consequence. He requested permission to transfer the recovered soil and artifacts to the State Museum's cold case exhibit, a place where evidence told stories the law could no longer prosecute. The DA agreed. Weeks later, Ortega visited the exhibit, a dim room lined with glass cases displaying relics of unfinished justice, typewriters, photographs, tags from missing persons boards. In the center, a small display labeled Emily Donovan, 1967-1992, contained the bracelet, a sliver of the diner's neon tubing, and a photograph of the river drum site. Tourists paused briefly reading the caption, then moved on. To them it was history. To Ortega it was a ledger of promises kept too late. At night he returned to his apartment, unable to sleep. The case had ended, but the sound of Bennett's words still looped in his mind. You think I got that drum into the truck alone? The soil had proven it true. There were always others, silent enablers, small cowards whose loyalty outweighed morality. He started writing a personal chronicle, not for publication but as record. A full narrative from 1992 to 2024, each year a layer of sediment over the same wound. He called it The Red Light That Wouldn't Die. In his manuscript he described the sign's glow visible through snow, the hum of power even when unplugged, the symbol of memory refusing darkness. One evening, while drafting, he received an envelope with no return address, handwritten, postmarked Johnstown. Inside was a single photo of the memorial plaque Hollis had installed, the words "In memory of Emily Donovan" circled in red pen. On the back, the same careful handwriting said, she deserved more than justice. She deserved time. Ortega looked at the photo for a long moment before placing it inside the manuscript folder. He didn't recognize the handwriting, but part of him hoped it belonged to someone who still cared, someone who remembered. When the gas station expansion project resumed that summer, he returned one last time before the asphalt was poured. The workers let him stand near the trench as they backfilled the soil. The evening light caught the gravel, turning it gold for an instant before the first layer of blacktop covered it. Ortega thought of Frank and Linda, of Hollis, of all the years that had burned away between one winter night and this quiet closure. He whispered the same words Hollis had told him once in a diner long ago. Some walls you hold up by remembering what fell. Then he turned away before the machines finished. Driving home along Route 56, he passed the curve where the neon once glowed. The road had new signage, new paint, but for a second he saw it again, the faint reflection of red light in his windshield, flickering as if time itself were replaying the moment endlessly. He didn't slow down. He understood finally that stories like this never truly end. They fade, buried under layers of retelling, until someone digs again. The best a detective can hope for is to leave the truth close enough to the surface that the next person can find it. That night he placed his manuscript beside the case file and sealed both in a weatherproof box. He planned to donate it to the county archive with a note. To whoever reopens this someday, look for the signs in plain sight. They never lie. Then he shut off the lights, leaving the office in darkness except for a thin red standby glow from the power strip, a single unblinking dot, like the diner's neon heart refusing to die. By 2025, the story of Emily Donovan no longer belonged only to Johnstown. It had become part of the wider folklore of American true crime, a case that slipped between fact and legend until even the locals weren't sure which details were real. The streaming documentary that aired that February, The Red Light That Wouldn't Die, changed everything. Produced by a small Pennsylvania media collective, it combined archival footage, interview transcripts, and dramatized reenactments of the blizzard night, narrated in a calm female voice that treated every fact as a ghost returning to speak once more. Within weeks, it ranked among the top-viewed true crime releases in the region. The diner's image, recreated in soft blue lighting with the word "open" flickering, became an icon across social media, a symbol of vanishing, of how ordinary life could tip into myth. But what the viewers didn't know, what even the filmmakers hadn't been able to include, was that the final fragments of Emily's story were still unfolding off camera, in the silence of archives and old letters. Detective Luis Ortega, now retired, watched the premiere alone in his living room, the glow of the television washing over boxes of case files stacked like furniture. He'd consulted briefly for the production but refused on-screen credit. Watching actors play versions of people he'd known, Bennett, Keene, Kavanaugh, Linda, felt like trespassing on memory. The dramatization of the blizzard made the snow look too clean, too cinematic. In reality, he remembered it as yellowed by streetlight, thick and grimy, snow that smelled of iron and diesel. But the filmmakers got some things right. The muffled quiet of the closed town, the way isolation itself became part of the crime. When the reenactment showed a red silhouette fading into white, Ortega leaned forward instinctively, feeling the same chill he'd felt standing in the snow years before. The credits rolled with a dedication for all the missing whose stories wait in the cold. After the broadcast, his phone buzzed with messages from reporters and former colleagues. Everyone wanted new commentary, a quote, a reflection. Ortega deleted them all. Instead, he drove to the county archive where his sealed manuscript and casebox had been stored. He hadn't visited since the day he donated them. The archivist recognized him immediately, eyes wide with curiosity. "You know your file's the most requested one here now?" she said. Students, podcasters, even filmmakers, they all come asking for the real ending. Ortega smiled faintly. "There is no real ending," he said. "Only the parts people choose to remember." He asked to see the box. The archivist led him to the climate-controlled room where rows of history slept behind glass. The label read, "Gracious Donovan Investigation, 1992-2024. He ran his fingers along the lid but didn't open it. Instead, he left a single envelope beside it, addressed to future investigators. Start with the light. That same spring, a film student from Pittsburgh named Maren Whitfield visited Johnstown to shoot a short thesis project about industrial ghosts. She had grown up hearing rumors about the diner case, stories passed down through her grandmother who'd once eaten there after high school dances. Maren's approach was different. Less crime, more memory. She filmed long shots of the highway at night, the reflections of red brake lights bleeding across wet pavement. Locals told her that sometimes, when fog rolled down from the hills, you could still see a red shimmer where the old diner used to stand, hovering faintly over the gas pumps. They called it the Donovan Light. Most thought it was just refracted tail lamps from passing cars, but others swore it pulsed slower, steadier, like a heartbeat. Maren filmed it for an hour, one foggy evening. Later, reviewing the footage frame by frame, she saw the light flicker once, twice, then vanish exactly as a freight train's horn echoed across the valley. A coincidence, maybe, but haunting enough to end her film on. Her documentary premiered at a local festival under the title The Donovan Light. It wasn't about evidence or guilt, but about how memory anchors itself to place. She included interviews with residents who'd grown up hearing their parents talk about the girl who disappeared in the snow. One elderly man recalled being a boy when search parties combed the fields. "They told us to look for red cloth," he said, voice trembling. "All I found was a glove, but it wasn't hers. My mother burned it anyway." Another woman admitted she'd worked with Bennett years later and never suspected a thing. "He fixed my faucet," she said softly. "He said you can tell how a thing's built by how it breaks." When the short film circulated online, viewers left comments mixing empathy with superstition. Some insisted the red light was a warning, others a sign that Emily's spirit still lingered to keep the town honest. Local businesses capitalized. A diner-themed coffee shop opened downtown, serving red light roast and hanging vintage photos of the old highway. The irony wasn't lost on Ortega when he visited one afternoon. The barista, unaware of who he was, asked if he wanted to sign the guest wall for Emily. He took the pen and wrote simply, "For the ones who stay." Meanwhile, in academic circles, the Donovan investigation became a case study in forensic persistence and community trauma. Law students analyzed how technology, particularly enhanced DNA and soil spectrometry, had shifted the outcome decades later. Psychologists used it to illustrate the concept of collective haunting, how unresolved crimes infect local identity until they are metabolized through story. A University of Pittsburgh sociology paper titled "Locked Doors. Open Wounds" argued that the case symbolized a generational reckoning, the collapse of trust between industrial labor solidarity and personal accountability. Ortega read the paper and underlined a single line: "When no one speaks, silence becomes the architecture of guilt." He copied it into his notebook beneath the date, April 14, 2025. That same month, he received an invitation from a local radio host who was recording an anniversary special. They wanted him to share reflections from inside the investigation. He almost declined, but something about the phrasing, "inside," made him reconsider. The studio was small, lit by a single red on-air sign that reminded him painfully of the diner's glow. During the interview, the host asked, "After all these years, do you think justice was served?" Ortega hesitated. "Justice is a word we use when we can't fix what happened," he said. "We solved a mystery, but that's not the same as making something right." The host pressed, "What stays with you most?" He thought for a moment. "Her mother," he said finally. "She kept calling the sheriff's office long after they stopped answering. She said, 'I just need to know if she's cold.' I didn't understand then. Now I do. It's not the body we look for, it's the warmth we lost with it." After the broadcast aired, letters began arriving at the station addressed to Ortega, dozens of them, from listeners who'd lost loved ones in unsolved cases. They thanked him for giving voice to what justice never could. One envelope contained a Polaroid of a snowy field with a caption, "She's warm now. No return address." Later that year, as part of the State Museum's Echoes of Evidence exhibit expansion, Ortega was invited to give a closing lecture. He stood before a small crowd beneath dim lighting, the case display glowing faintly behind him. "We think of cold cases as stories frozen in time," he said, "but really they're heat maps, the places where memory refuses to cool." He spoke of Bennett's confession, Keene's guilt, the soil tests, the reforms, but mostly he spoke of endurance. A single act can vanish a person, but it takes hundreds of quiet acts to remember them. Every file, every photograph, every retelling, that's how the world resists forgetting. When he finished, the audience stood in silence. Outside, dusk settled over Harrisburg, and in the museum window, the reflection of the red display light shimmered against the glass like a distant echo of the diner's sign. Months later, Ortega finally retired completely, selling his house and moving to a small cottage near Lake Erie. He brought few possessions: a stack of notebooks, a framed newspaper clipping, and a jar of soil from the excavation site. In the evenings, he sat on the porch, watching the sun drop into the water, the sky turning that same rusted red as the neon he'd chased all those years. He told neighbors he was just an old detective who liked quiet, but occasionally children from the area would visit, curious about the stories they'd heard online. He'd show them the jar and say, "Everything you ever bury, the earth remembers." Sometimes he'd see their faces reflected in the glass, half curious, half afraid, and he'd smile gently. "Don't worry," he'd add. "The truth doesn't haunt you if you tell it." On the 33rd anniversary of Emily's disappearance, a small memorial service was held by the County Historical Society. Hollis had passed away the previous winter, her ashes scattered along the river where the drum was found. Ortega attended quietly at the back as students read excerpts from her diary and placed red votive candles in a circle. One candle refused to stay lit, flickering in the wind until finally its flame steadied. A photographer captured the moment, and the image went viral, 9 candles glowing in snow, one brighter than the rest. Online captions called it the light that stayed. After the ceremony, Ortega drove back along Route 56. The gas station was still there, brighter than ever, but as he passed, a faint red reflection shimmered on his windshield. Just a flash, then gone. He didn't look back. Instead, he whispered a small prayer. "You're seen." Somewhere behind him, traffic lights changed, engines roared, life went on. But in the quiet between radio stations, he could almost hear the hum of that old neon sign, steady and low, the sound of memory itself refusing to die.